It was a chilly morning when everything changed for Max, a lovable golden retriever who had always been the center of attention in his neighborhood. The small suburban town where he lived was quiet, and life flowed in its usual routine. People would stop by to pet him, and children would laugh as they played with him in the yard. But today, something felt different. Max had been acting strangely over the past few weeks. His usually playful energy had subdued. He spent more time resting, his eyes tired and distant. At first, his owners, Sarah and Mark, thought it was just the weather or perhaps he was getting older. But there was something else, a quiet unease that they couldn't quite pinpoint. One morning, as Sarah was walking down the street, a neighbor stopped her. "Is Max expecting?" the neighbor asked, a playful smile on their face. Sarah laughed, shrugging it off. Max had been spending more time near the back of the yard lately, sniffing around as if looking for something. The rumor spread quickly through the neighborhood. People would stop by and ask if Max was going to have puppies. They made jokes about how adorable it would be to see tiny golden retriever pups running around the yard. Sarah and Mark chuckled at first, believing it was just a harmless thought. But soon, the questions turned serious. People started leaving toys and gifts for the pups, assuming Max was expecting. But the truth was something that no one could have imagined. Max had always been a well-cared-for dog. Sarah made sure he had the best food, regular vet visits, and plenty of toys. But lately, it seemed like something was wrong. His once playful demeanor had shifted, and he wasn't as energetic as usual. When Sarah took him to the vet for a routine checkup, she hoped it was just a minor health issue, maybe something temporary. But when the vet called him in for the results, Sarah's heart dropped. The vet's face was grave. Max wasn't expecting puppies at all. In fact, he was sick. Very sick. The truth was far more heartbreaking than anyone could have ever imagined. Max wasn't carrying a litter of puppies. He was suffering from a medical condition that was slowly draining him of his vitality. The real truth had shocked everyone. No one had seen it coming. It had been a month since Max's visit to the vet. Since that day, Sarah and Mark's lives had shifted in ways they could never have anticipated. What began as an innocent belief that Max was expecting puppies turned into a crushing reality that neither of them could fully process. It wasn't just a moment of heartbreak. It was a slow, cruel unraveling of hope, a painful reminder of how quickly things could change. Sarah had spent sleepless nights, sitting by Max's side, watching him closely. Her thoughts constantly circled back to the moment the vet had delivered the diagnosis. The vet had said that Max's condition, canine lymphoma, was often hard to catch early. It wasn't just because of the similarity to pregnancy symptoms. There was no obvious way to know. For weeks, Max had seemed perfectly fine. He had still chased after his favorite tennis ball, still wagged his tail when Sarah came home. He hadn't shown any of the obvious signs that would have prompted Sarah to take him to the vet earlier. But now, as she watched him struggle to climb the stairs or collapse in exhaustion after a short walk, the truth became too evident. The vet had given him options for treatment, including chemotherapy, which would potentially give Max a few more months. It wasn't a cure. Nothing could cure lymphoma once it had progressed this far, but it might offer some relief, some way to fight back against the illness, to give Max a chance to live the final months of his life with dignity. That was the hardest part to swallow. The fact that there were no guarantees, that the dogs Sarah and Mark had loved so fiercely might not be with them for much longer. Sarah would have done anything for Max. She would have moved heaven and earth if it meant saving him. But she couldn't move time. She couldn't stop the march of the disease inside him. And no matter what treatments they tried, it couldn't reverse the fact that Max's body was slowly being consumed by cancer. It was a sunny morning when the weight of Max's diagnosis truly settled in. Sarah had taken him out to the backyard, as she often did, hoping for a moment of joy to brighten the bleakness of the past few weeks. But Max didn't run toward the open space like he used to. Instead, he lingered near the back fence, sniffing the ground in a way that seemed more tired than curious. "Come on, buddy," Sarah encouraged softly, bending down to pet him. His tail gave a weak wag, but there was no excitement in his movements. He was slower now, more deliberate, like everything in life took more effort than it once had. Sarah's heart broke every time she saw him like this, and yet there was still love in his eyes, still that deep, unwavering connection between them. She knelt beside him, stroking his fur, and for the first time, she allowed herself to cry. Max had been the one to comfort her during the worst days of her life. When Sarah had gone through tough times, losing her job, losing her father, Max was there with his warm, patient presence. Now, as he lay beside her, she wondered if she had done enough to return that love. Had she done enough for him? Could she have noticed sooner? Mark had always been the optimist. He tried to stay positive about the treatments. He told Sarah that Max was still fighting and that there was always a chance for recovery. He didn't want to see the sadness in Sarah's eyes, didn't want to acknowledge that Max's time was running out. But Sarah knew the truth. It hung in the air like a heavy fog. She knew it wasn't going to be okay. She just didn't know how to make peace with it. When the neighbors at first assumed Max was expecting puppies, Sarah had tried to play along, laughing at the notion. At first, the idea of Max having puppies seemed absurd but fun. People were excited. After all, Max had been the beloved dog of the neighborhood. The idea of him having a litter of puppies to share with everyone was a source of joy. Children had started talking about how they would each get to pick out a puppy when the time came, imagining how fun it would be to raise a little Max of their own. Sarah and Mark found themselves in an awkward position. They didn't want to disappoint anyone, and the excitement about the puppies was palpable. At first, they let it go. They smiled and nodded when people asked about the pups, even though they knew deep down that the whole idea was just a sweet fantasy. But as the weeks passed, the questions became more insistent. Mrs. Henderson, their neighbor who had asked first, came by one afternoon with a basket of dog toys. "We've all been so excited to meet Max's puppies," she exclaimed. "Is there a due date yet?" Sarah, standing in the doorway with a forced smile, couldn't bring herself to tell Mrs. Henderson the truth just yet. She had been avoiding the topic, not knowing how to explain that Max wasn't expecting at all. She felt a pang of guilt every time someone asked, but the truth was so much harder to face. The idea of telling the community that Max wasn't expecting puppies, that he was instead suffering from a terminal illness, felt like a betrayal to their beloved dog. Eventually, Sarah couldn't hide it any longer. When Mrs. Henderson came by again, Sarah was sitting on the porch, Max lying at her feet, his head resting on her lap. With a heavy heart, she told Mrs. Henderson what had really been going on, explaining Max's diagnosis, his fight against cancer, and the heartbreaking truth that there would be no puppies. Mrs. Henderson's face fell as she listened. She was kind, and she promised to share the news with the rest of the neighborhood. But Sarah could tell that the entire neighborhood's excitement had been built on a misunderstanding. They had expected something so different. They had hoped for joy, puppies, laughter, a new life to celebrate. But instead, they would have to face the reality that Max, their beloved dog, was sick and running out of time. Over the next few weeks, Max's health continued to deteriorate. The chemotherapy, while offering some hope, didn't bring the miracle they had prayed for. His appetite waned and the sparkle in his eyes dimmed. The joyful, energetic dog they had known for years seemed like a distant memory, and in its place was a dog who barely had the strength to wag his tail. Sarah and Mark made sure he was comfortable, but nothing could truly prepare them for the inevitable. Every day felt like a countdown. Sarah found herself keeping track of Max's small victories. If he ate a little more food than usual or walked a little farther without collapsing, it felt like a win. But these moments of progress were fleeting. The disease was relentless, and Max's body was failing him faster than they could keep up. Max's declining health had an impact on the entire household. Mark, who had always been the one to keep things light and optimistic, grew quieter. He spent more time with Max, trying to comfort him, but even he knew the inevitable was coming. Sarah, on the other hand, threw herself into caring for Max. She spent hours researching alternative treatments, visiting different veterinarians, trying anything that could help him, but nothing seemed to work. There were days when Sarah would sit with Max, brushing his fur, and crying softly as she spoke to him. She told him how much she loved him, how much he had meant to her and Mark. She apologized for not noticing sooner, for not seeing the signs earlier. And then, when her tears had dried, she would smile through the sadness and say, "You're my best friend, Max. I'll never forget you." The day Sarah and Mark had been dreading finally arrived. Max's breathing had become labored, his movements slow and painful. He lay on his bed by the window, where he always liked to sit and watch the world go by. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the room, and Max's eyes fluttered open as Sarah approached. She knelt beside him, stroking his fur one last time, whispering words of comfort. She looked up at Mark, who was standing nearby, tears streaming down his face. Neither of them spoke. They both knew this was the end. Max's tail gave a weak wag, a final sign of recognition of the love he had always carried for them. And then, just as quietly as he had lived, Max took his last breath. The room was filled with an aching silence. The house felt unnervingly empty after Max's passing. Sarah and Mark moved through their home as though in a fog, each step more distant than the last. Every room, every corner held a memory of their beloved dog. His favorite spot by the door, where he'd always wait for Sarah to come home, was now just an empty space. The soft, rhythmic thudding of Max's tail against the floor, a sound that had filled their home for years, was now replaced by an eerie silence that no amount of light could lift. The morning after Max died, Sarah woke up early, her mind racing. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and her chest felt as though a heavy weight had settled there, something she couldn't escape, no matter how hard she tried to breathe. She stumbled out of bed, walking to the window where Max used to sit, his golden fur shining in the sunlight as he basked in the warmth of the day. But today, the light fell hollow. It was as if the world had moved on without him, and she was left behind in a quiet, dark room filled with ghosts. She walked into the living room, and Mark was already sitting on the couch. His eyes were red, and he had his head buried in his hands. He didn't look up when she entered, and for a moment Sarah thought he might be asleep. But then he lifted his head, meeting her gaze, and his eyes reflected everything she felt: grief, confusion, and a deep sorrow that words couldn't fully capture. "I still can't believe it," he whispered. "It doesn't feel real, Sarah. How do we move on from this?" Sarah didn't have an answer. How could she? They had spent so many years together with Max. He had been their constant, their friend, their protector. And now that presence was gone. The thought of never hearing Max's paws on the floor again, never feeling the warmth of his body curled up beside him on the couch, was almost unbearable. "I don't know," Sarah whispered, sitting beside him. Her fingers brushed through her hair, a nervous habit she had when she didn't know what to say. "I thought I would be okay. I thought we'd have more time." Mark nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the framed pictures of Max on the mantelpiece. "We all did, but we didn't. And now he's gone." The conversation hung in the air, thick with grief, until Sarah stood up and walked over to the door. She grabbed Max's leash and collar from the hook by the door, holding them in her hands for a long moment, her heart aching as she ran her fingers over familiar leather. These were the objects that had accompanied him through countless walks, through the park, the neighborhood, the quiet moments that had now become distant memories. "I don't know how we'll fill the space," Sarah whispered. Mark walked over to her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "We won't fill it. We just live with it. We keep his memory with us. That's all we can do now." The weight of his words sank in. The loss of Max wasn't something they could ever truly overcome. But in some way, they would have to learn how to live with it, to carry the love they'd shared with their dog as a quiet strength, even in the face of the emptiness that now surrounded them. As the day wore on, Sarah and Mark went about their usual routine. They cleaned the house, made lunch, and did their best to pretend as though things were normal. But nothing felt normal. Max was no longer there to greet them, to share in the simple moments. It was as if their world had been irrevocably changed, and they were left to pick up the pieces. Just as Sarah was starting to fall into the heavy sadness that had settled over her heart, the doorbell rang. It was a soft, almost hesitant sound, as if whoever was standing outside was unsure whether it was the right time to come by. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether she wanted to answer, but then she realized it was too late for her to hide. She walked slowly to the door and opened it, revealing Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor who had been one of the first to ask about Max's supposed pregnancy. Mrs. Henderson stood there with a small, wrapped gift in her hands. She looked at Sarah with kind, sad eyes, her expression sympathetic. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice gentle. "I heard about Max. I didn't know how to offer my condolences, but I thought this might be a small gesture to remember him by. Sarah's throat tightened as she looked down at the gift in Mrs. Henderson's hands. She took it carefully, feeling the weight of the package. It was wrapped in soft, light-colored paper with a small ribbon tied around it. Mrs. Henderson had always been kind, but Sarah hadn't expected anything like this. "Thank you," Sarah said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't know what else to say. The words seemed inadequate in the face of the loss she felt. I didn't know what to say to anyone either. Mrs. Henderson smiled softly. "It's okay. We're all grieving together. Max was such a sweet dog. I know how much he meant to you both. I just wanted to let you know that we're here for you. If you need anything at all, just let us know." Sarah nodded, fighting back tears. "Thank you," she repeated, her voice thick with emotion. With a final, sympathetic glance, Mrs. Henderson left, leaving Sarah standing at the door holding the small gift. Mark walked over to her, looking down at the package in her hands. "Who was it?" he asked, his voice quiet. "It's from Mrs. Henderson," Sarah replied. She just wanted to offer her condolences. They both sat down on the couch, the gift resting between them. Sarah slowly untied the ribbon and peeled back the paper. Inside, she found a small frame, one that looked like it had been carefully crafted by hand. There was a picture of Max, one of the many photos they had taken of him over the years. A picture of him lying in the sun, eyes half closed, his fur glowing golden in the light. At the bottom of the frame, there was a small inscription. "In loving memory of Max, a friend who brought joy to all who knew him." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she looked at the photo. It was as though Mrs. Henderson had understood. She had captured the essence of Max, the peaceful, joyful spirit that had been his hallmark. He had brought so much joy to their lives, and now that joy would live on in this simple frame, a small but beautiful tribute to their beloved dog. "It's perfect," Sarah said softly, her voice breaking as she looked at Mark. "Max will always be with us, in our hearts and in this picture." Mark pulled her close, and they sat together in silence, holding each other in the frame. For a moment, they were able to forget the pain, to hold on to the love that had always been there, even in the hardest of times. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And as Sarah sat there, Max's memory flickering in the frame in front of her, she realized that even in the face of loss, they had something powerful, the love they had shared with their dog. Max might not have been with them physically, but his spirit would forever remain a part of their lives, a part of their family. No matter how much time passed, no matter how much the world moved on, Max's love would endure, and that was something they would carry with them, always. The days following Max's death blurred together, each one sinking into the next, and the house seemed to echo with an emptiness that was hard to ignore. It wasn't just the absence of Max's physical presence that left a hole. It was the stillness that had replaced the vibrancy he had brought to every room. The daily routines that had once been filled with joy now felt like a hollow mimicry of their past life. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was living in a world that had somehow shifted. Where the familiar comfort of Max's warmth was forever gone. She still found herself reaching out in the mornings, expecting to feel the soft pressure of his head nudging her hand, his quiet request for a belly rub. But there was nothing. The mornings felt heavier, like an unwelcome reminder of what they had lost. Mark had taken going for long runs in the mornings, trying to outrun the sadness that had taken root in his chest. He found it hard to stay in one place for too long, knowing that Max's absence would hit him like a wave when he stopped moving. Sarah understood. She had her own ways of coping. Sometimes she would sit in the living room, staring at the frame Mrs. Henderson had given them, clutching it in her hands as if the picture could somehow bring Max back to life. But the longer she stared, the harder it became to hold on to the image of the vibrant, energetic dog she once knew. In the quiet moments, when the house was still, Sarah would remember the soft sound of Max's paws padding through the house, his tail swishing behind him as he moved from room to room. She remembered how his presence filled every space. Max had never needed words to communicate with her. His love was expressed through his actions, through the way he followed her around the house, always by her side, always ready to comfort her, with a simple nuzzle when the weight of the world seemed too much to bear. Sarah missed those small, everyday moments. And with each passing day, the grief only seemed to grow. One afternoon, as she sat by the window. The quiet was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Henderson again, her arms full of the basket. Sarah stood up slowly, wiping the tears from her eyes, still not entirely sure what to expect. "Mrs. Henderson," she said softly, opening the door. "I wasn't expecting—" "I know," Mrs. Henderson replied, her tone gentle but firm. "I thought I'd bring you this. You're not alone, Sarah. You and Mark aren't alone in this." Sarah felt a pang of guilt, realizing how much she had withdrawn from her neighbors and the community since Max's passing. She had retreated into herself, too consumed by her grief to connect with anyone outside of the house. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, taking the basket from Mrs. Henderson's hands. "You've been so kind to us. But I don't know if I can talk about it right now. I'm not sure I'm ready to face people yet." Mrs. Henderson nodded, understanding completely. "I know. I just wanted you to have something that might help you remember Max and honor his memory. It's a small thing, but I hope it helps." Sarah opened the basket, her fingers trembling as she removed the contents. Inside was a small ceramic urn, beautifully crafted with intricate designs. The words "in loving memory" were engraved on its surface, and beneath it there was a space for a picture. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't even considered the idea of cremating Max. The thought had been too overwhelming, too final, for her to even entertain. "I thought you might like this," Mrs. Henderson continued. "You can put a picture of Max in it. I know it's not the same, but maybe it will bring some comfort." Sarah stood frozen for a moment, staring at the urn. It felt like too much. The idea of holding on to Max's ashes, of having his physical form reduced to something so small, was almost unbearable. But she realized that this was part of the process, part of coming to terms with the reality that Max was gone. She had always thought of him as more than just a pet, but now she had to learn to live with the absence of him in the physical world. "Thank you," Sarah whispered again, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Mrs. Henderson said warmly. "I just want you to know that we're here for you. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." As Mrs. Henderson left, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. It was true she wasn't alone. The kindness of her neighbors and the memories of Max's love were the only things that seemed to hold her together. But the pain was still there, raw and unrelenting, a constant reminder that the world had gone on without Max in it. Days passed, and the grief seemed to settle into a routine, one that Sarah and Mark could no longer avoid. They had moments of peace, where they were able to share small smiles or laugh at old memories. But the sadness was always there, lurking in the background. Mark found solace in his morning runs, while Sarah spent her time working on a scrapbook she had started for Max, trying to capture every moment of his life that she could remember. One evening, after a long, exhausting day, Sarah sat down with the urn in front of her. She held it in her hands, her fingers tracing the words that were engraved on its surface. She had never imagined that she would be here, in this moment, holding on to the remains of a dog who had meant so much to her. The finality of it struck her hard, and for a few moments she just sat there, her eyes filling with tears. But then something unexpected happened. As Sarah stared at the urn, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. It wasn't peace, not exactly, but it was a soft acceptance. She realized that, while Max was gone from the physical world, his love would remain with her forever. The memories of their time together, the lessons he had taught her about unconditional love and loyalty, would never fade. As she placed Max's picture inside the urn, she whispered softly, "Thank you for everything, Max. You'll always be with me." Mark came into the room just as Sarah finished placing the photo in the urn. He walked over to her, kneeling beside her, his hands gently taking the urn from her lap. "It's perfect," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. Sarah nodded, wiping away her tears. "It's the only way I know how to hold on to him. This is our way of keeping him close, of honoring the love we had for him." Mark kissed her forehead, holding her in his arms for a long time. They sat there in the quiet room, the urn between them, and for the first time in days, Sarah felt a small sense of peace. She knew that the pain would never fully go away, but she also knew that the love Max had given them would live on in their hearts, forever a part of their story. As they sat there, surrounded by memories, Sarah realized that grief was not a journey with a clear end. It was a process, one that could never be rushed. She and Mark would learn to navigate it, step by step, day by day. But in the end, Max would always be with them. And that thought, though bittersweet, gave Sarah the strength to carry on. The weeks that followed Max's passing were difficult, and the house seemed to settle into an uneasy quiet. Sarah and Mark had tried their best to continue with life, but everything felt different. Each room seemed empty without Max's presence, and each day without his joyful tail wagging felt hollow. But in the stillness, they began to find small moments of healing. Sarah spent a lot of time reflecting on the love they had shared with Max. She found herself walking through the neighborhood with Mark, taking slow, deliberate steps, allowing herself to remember the best moments. The walks through the park, the lazy afternoons spent curled up on the couch, the way Max would greet them at the door with boundless energy, no matter how long they had been away. Those moments were now memories, but they would always be a part of her, forever ingrained in the fabric of her life. Mark, on the other hand, had thrown himself back into his work, trying to keep his mind occupied. But even in the busy hours of the day, there was a lingering emptiness. He had always been the one to stay strong for Sarah, the one to keep the optimism alive when things got tough. But after Max's death, Mark found himself lost, adrift in a sea of emotions he couldn't quite name. The one thing that helped both of them heal, albeit slowly, was a small urn that held Max's remains. It sat on the mantelpiece, along with a framed picture of their beloved dog, a reminder of the love that had once filled their home. It wasn't a simple object to them. It was a symbol of everything Max had meant to them, a token of the years of companionship, comfort, and joy he had provided. Every evening before bed, Sarah and Mark would sit together in the living room, the urn between them. It became their quiet ritual, a way to reconnect with the love they had shared with Max, to honor his memory and keep him close, even though he was no longer physically with them. On one particular evening, as the sun began to set and the house grew dim, Sarah stood by the window, looking out at the empty yard. She remembered the countless hours Max had spent out there, running through the grass, chasing after sticks, rolling in the dirt with pure joy. The yard seemed colder now, emptier. It was hard for her to imagine it without him. And yet, there was a strange kind of peace settling in as she realized that Max was still with them, in every blade of grass, in every corner of the house, in every memory they had built together. "I think we're finally starting to heal," Sarah whispered to Mark, who had walked up behind her. Mark stood beside her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Yeah, I think so, too," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet sadness, but also a quiet acceptance. "It's still hard, but we'll be okay. We have each other, and we have Max's love. We always will." Sarah smiled, though it was a bittersweet smile, and looked up at the urn on the mantelpiece. "I've been thinking about something," she said slowly. "I think it's time to scatter Max's ashes. I want to do it somewhere special, somewhere that he loved. Maybe by the lake, where we used to take him. He always loved the water." Mark nodded thoughtfully. "I think that would be a beautiful idea. It's where he was happiest." The decision, though emotionally charged, felt right. Sarah and Mark both knew it was time to let Max go in a way that would honor his life and the joy he had brought to theirs. They had kept his memory close, and now it was time to give him back to the world that he had loved so much, to let him rest in peace where he had always been happiest. The following weekend, Sarah and Mark packed a small bag and set out early in the morning, Max's urn in the back seat. The drive was quiet, but the silence was comforting. It was as though they were honoring Max's memory in every mile they traveled, every curve of the road. They reached the lake by late morning, the sun shining brightly, casting shimmering reflections across the water. It was a peaceful, serene place, just as it had been all those years ago when they would visit with Max. They parked near the shore, and Sarah took the urn in her hands. As they walked to the water's edge, Mark gently put his arm around Sarah, offering the support she needed without saying a word. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool breeze on her face as she stood at the lake, staring out at the horizon. Max had always loved the water. He would chase after sticks, swim in the cool depths, and even wade to the shallow areas, his paws splashing in the ripples. It felt right to bring him here, to let him go in a place that had always brought him so much joy. With a final silent goodbye, Sarah and Mark knelt down together, scattering Max's ashes over the lake. The wind carried the ashes gently across the surface of the water, and for a moment, everything felt still. As the last traces of Max drifted away, Sarah felt a sense of peace wash over her. Max was free now, resting in a place he had loved, surrounded by the beauty that had always been a part of him. "Goodbye, Max," Sarah whispered softly, her voice cracking with emotion. "We'll always love you. You'll always be in our hearts." Mark stood beside her, holding her close. "Always," he agreed quietly. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a weight lift from her chest. It wasn't that the pain was gone. It would never fully disappear, but she felt that they had done the right thing. They had let Max go, but they had also made sure his memory would live on. They would carry his love with them for the rest of their lives, and that, in itself, was enough. They stood there together, watching the lake, the quiet morning unfolding around them. There were no words needed, only the peaceful silence that had become their way of honoring Max's memory. When they returned home that afternoon, the house seemed a little less empty. There was still the quiet, but it was no longer oppressive. They had let Max go, but they had done it in a way that felt right. They had honored his life, his spirit, and his love. And with that, they knew that they could finally begin to move forward, carrying Max's memory with them, always. Max had taught them the most important lessons of all: love, loyalty, and the unspoken bond that can never be broken. And though he was no longer there with them physically, his spirit would always remain a part of their lives forever. As Sarah and Mark sat together that evening, their hearts full of love and gratitude for the dog who had meant so much to them, they knew that they would never forget him. Max's legacy would live on in every shared memory, every quiet moment of peace, and every wag of a tail that they would one day see again. Max was gone, but he would never truly be forgotten.